Thank you for joining me. Today we'll be discussing the ethical debate on the prohibition of cannabis. I will be your host, Rick Ornelas. First, we'll dive into the introduction topics. Starting with the cannabis prohibition timeline, various data concerning cannabis prohibition, the prohibition cons and prohibition pros, and finally, ethical implications. Looking at the timeline, we begin in 1600 through the 1890s, where domestic production of hemp was encouraged for numerous types of products such as ropes, sails, and clothing. The drug itself, marijuana or pot, is the mixture of dried leaves, shredded flowers, and leaves that come from the female version of the species of plant. In 1920s, we begin to see an influx of marijuana prohibition, the preliminary version of it. After the Mexican Revolution in 1910, Mexican immigrants flooded the United States, introducing a culture of recreational use of marijuana. Through this, anti-drug campaigners warned against what they called the marijuana menace that led to terrible crimes that were attributed to the use of marijuana and the Mexicans who used it. In 1930, we see the creation of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, headed by Harry J. Anslinger, who was the first commissioner. In 1932, we begin to see preliminary acts by the federal government to stop narcotics, specifically the Uniform State Narcotic Act, which put pressure on states to adopt it in order to strongly regulate and encourage governments to take responsibility of drug using. In 1937, we see the first act that directly affects marijuana. The statute effectively in 1937, Marijuana Tax Act, effectively criminalized marijuana, restricting possession of the drug to individuals who paid an excise tax for certain authorized medical and industrial use. In 1944, LaGuardia reports find marijuana less dangerous. New York Academy of Medicine issued an extensive research report declaring that, contrary to earlier research and popular belief in the 1930s, use of marijuana did not introduce violence, insanity, or sex crimes or lead to addiction of other drugs. In 1951 and 1956, we see the begin of the war on drugs, with stricter sentencing of laws. Specifically, in enactment of federal laws, Boggs Act 1952, Narcotics Control Act 1956, which set mandatory sentences for drug-related offenses, including marijuana. A first offense of marijuana possession carried a minimum sentence of 2 to 10 years with a fine upwards of $20,000. In 1960, we see marijuana take over the counterculture. A change, and this is due to a change in political and cultural climate, was reflected in more lenient attitudes towards marijuana. Going into 1970, a repeal of most mandatory minimum sentence / marijuana differentiated from other drugs. The Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act categorized marijuana separately from other narcotics and eliminated mandatory federal sentences for possession of small amounts. In 1973, the creation of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, also known as the DEA, took place. In 1976, the beginning of what is called the Parent Movement Against Marijuana took place. This is a nationwide movement emerged of conservative parents, groups lobbying for stricter regulation of marijuana and prevention of drug use by teenagers. In 1986, we see another ramp-up of the war on drugs. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act and mandatory sentencing was passed by Ronald Reagan. This act instituted mandatory sentences for drug-related crimes in conjunction with the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984. The new law raised federal penalties for marijuana possession and dealing, basing, and penalizing on amounts of the drug involved. Possession of 100 marijuana plants received the same penalty as the possession of 100 grams of heroin. A later amendment to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act established what they call a 3-strike rule, and you're out, like baseball. This policy requiring life sentences for repeat drug offenders and providing for the drug penalty for the kingpins. Fast forward to 1996, we see the change in the American population's belief on marijuana, specifically in the medicinal uses. We see first the state of California, who legalized it for medical purposes in 1996. In 1998 through 2001, we see national change through state legislation on medical cannabis. In states such as Arizona, Alaska, Oregon, Washington, New Mexico, Maine, Colorado, Nevada, Hawaii, Vermont, Montana, Rhode Island, Michigan, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Delaware, and Connecticut specifically passed acts statewide that enabled users to use cannabis with medical license. In 2012, we see the first ever states who approve recreational use. In Washington and Colorado, who approve it and tax it similar to tobacco and alcohol. In 2013, the U.S. sees a landslide with state laws. The Justice Department will not sue or block laws legalizing marijuana in 20 states and the District of Columbia. In 2013, election victories. Marijuana proponents' second significant victories in election night in Colorado, Maine, and Michigan. Colorado's backed a heavy tax on recreational marijuana made legal the year before to pay the cost overseeing the state's marijuana industry as well as school construction. Next, we dive into the data of marijuana. We look at the medical usage of marijuana and the states where marijuana are used. In the United States map to the left shows how many patients in the thousands are using medical marijuana in each state. As you can see, multiple states on the West Coast who is considered to be more lenient in their laws have a higher percentage of marijuana patients, the highest of which is seen in New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Montana. In the East Coast, we see a much rarer and much less significant trend, with only Michigan and New Hampshire as the leading states in medical marijuana patient usage. To the graph to my right, we see what medical marijuana is usually used for, with the primary usage being chronic pain, followed by insomnia and stress. Next data, we look at the U.S. Justice Department, specifically the war on drugs. The U.S. drug control spending of 2015 is the graph to my left, in which you can see how spending is distributed throughout the entire criminal justice system. As you can see, the largest chunk is placed in domestic law enforcement, followed by treatment. This is a significant amount of $9.3 million. This is significant for one reason and one reason only. To enforce the war on drugs, the law enforcement must be funded in order to have the proper equipment and training. Instead, if prohibition was to be uplifted by some federal regulation, this money can be allocated in different places such as prevention or increased treatment. Now, if we look on the war on drugs, specifically on the marijuana, you can see how arrests are made specifically on the specific type of drug. 44%, which is almost 50% of the total arrest of the war on drugs, is made on marijuana possession. If we combine these two graphs, we can see a trend that is very, very interesting. With domestic law enforcement being funded largely, but with $9.3 million, they're using this money to specifically target marijuana possession. So if marijuana was made legal, the argument can be made that less money could be spent on the criminal justice system, specifically domestic law enforcement, and placed into other needed areas such as prevention, treatment, or so on and so forth. Next, we look at the U.S. support of legalization of marijuana, as well as the economic factors ending a prohibition can bring. As you can see, upwards from 1969 to around 2010, the large amount of Americans perceived marijuana to be bad in terms of legalization. In 2010, we see the first switch ever. That leads to 2017, 64% of Americans choosing to say yes to the legalization of marijuana versus 34%. When this poll was originally asked, this was the opposite results. In 69, 12% of people said marijuana should be legal versus a staggering 84% of Americans said it should not be legal. To the graph to the right, we can see U.S. marijuana market. These graphs are also brought to you by Statista. The graph to my right indicates how recreational and medical marijuana markets break up in terms of billions of dollars in the U.S. The industry itself provides upwards of $2.7 billion a year. The majority of the market, as you can see, is being predicted from 2019 to 2025, what we like to call financial forecasting. With this, they expect the market to grow up to $24 billion, and that is both combined with recreational and medical, with recreational making up in the horizon value of 2025 of $13.2 billion. So that being said, if America's choices and views on marijuana have been changing over time, the argument can be made that the economic value is also changing the way Americans view marijuana as a whole. That, combined with the previous charts indicating the medicinal purposes of marijuana, show that the American people's viewpoints on marijuana have been changing. And if so, what is holding back the legalization of marijuana? The pros and arguments for legalization of marijuana go on as this. Cannabis is very much safer substance than that are already legal, like alcohol, prescription opioids, stimulants, and other drugs such as that. Cannabis has well-established medical benefits, especially in the management of chronic pain and cancer. Prohibition hasn't worked. The war on drugs has been unsuccessful. Thus, why the feelings of the American people have changed in favor 64% of legalization versus the 12% in 1969. Despite best efforts by law enforcement, inexpensive cannabis is widely available and widely used everywhere within the United States. Legal cannabis sales already total $4 billion a year and will double with the new states on board. This is a substantial tax resource for the states that would multiply further with the universal legalization. Criminalizing cannabis puts money in the hands of drug cartels rather than supporting the budgets of state governments. The resulting drug cartel financial power destabilizes the Mexican government and increases crime on both sides of the border, making it dangerous for both sides, Mexican and the United States, to control the war on drugs. Criminalizing cannabis is a distraction and a drain on limited resources of law enforcement, court, and correctional facilities. Now entering the cons. The argument against legalizing cannabis. Normalizing cannabis will increase its use, especially in teenagers. Legalization cannabis will result in more car, motorcycle, machine accidents. Monitoring pot use will be difficult on road and in the workplace. Cannabis is argued to be a gateway drug to harder drugs. Cannabis may cause an excrement of mental illnesses. Cannabis may cause medical diseases. Cannabis may cause motivational syndrome. Small kids may have accidental exposure via edible marijuana products or the lack of proper storage for marijuana products. Legalization of cannabis may encourage the development of more potent synthetic products with even more risks. With all this been stated, two ethical implications arise. The first is cannabis prohibition calls to question the extent of the government involvement in the lives of its constituency, weighed against the very individual freedoms of these people. Through absolute ideals about freedom, how to direct policy goals, implementation is often much too complicated to rely solely on theoretical principles. The arena of narcotics debate admits a range of attempts to reconcile personal liberties and interests of society. The second implication, the U.S.'s debate on marijuana legalization has grown stale with political buzzwords such as the war on drugs. The issue is complicated by the role of state rights, which does not directly involve the ethics of the policies so much as it does the country's federalist structure. The debate has been fought all around the political arena, with arguments on both sides relying on economic considerations, medical research, the Constitution, and more. However, these positive analyses will only carry us so far. The rest of the debate must be supported by normative evaluation that incorporates the findings into ethically sound policies. The last page will be the references that show you where I found the information and everything such has been presented to you today. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy and you find this presentation to be helpful and to understand the ethical debate on which prohibition of marijuana brings. Thank you.